It was a tense evening in May 2025 when White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt made the mistake that would unravel her career. During a Fox News special on global innovation and cyber diplomacy in the 21st century, she was engaged in a live discussion with President Ibrahim Traoré via satellite from Ouagadougou. What began as a calm exchange about AI ethics and international tech collaboration took a sharp turn when Tucker Carlson posed an unexpected question about Africa's rapid digital expansion. Karoline, how does the U.S. view leaders like President Traoré, who've invested so heavily in AI development across West Africa? Karoline offered a tight smile, the kind that had once made her a star in political media. "Tucker, let's speak plainly," she said with a tone that rang just a bit too smug. "President Traoré may talk about innovation and tech justice, but real progress isn't about flashy headlines or drone parades. It's about accountability and systems. And frankly," she added, "Burkina Faso's so-called AI miracle is built on stolen code and backdoor partnerships." Her next words, in hindsight, were catastrophic. "We have credible intelligence showing that much of their quantum architecture was reverse-engineered from American prototypes. That's not leadership, that's high-tech theft wrapped in Pan-African branding." The Fox News control room froze. Tucker Carlson looked stunned. On the split screen, Ibrahim sat motionless, eyes narrowing with cold precision. "Miss Leavitt," he said evenly, "I appreciate your honesty. Now allow me to correct a few of your alternative facts." In Ouagadougou, Ibrahim's aides exchanged uneasy glances. That particular calm in his voice was a storm warning. From his home office, Foreign Minister Dr. Alans Ouedraogo leaned forward. "She's made a serious mistake," he whispered to no one in particular. Ibrahim Traoré inhaled slowly, his mind preparing a systematic rebuttal that would leave no doubt. "Ms. Leavitt," he began, voice composed but iron-edged, "since you accuse my country of intellectual theft, let me share some information publicly. Since you've chosen that stage." He tapped a tablet. Behind him, a screen lit up with classified clearance logs, software development chains, and partnership documents. "First," he said, "our codebase is entirely open source and has been audited by the European Cyber Council, the MIT Technology Review, and notably, the U.S. Department of Energy. All found no traces of unauthorized material." Tucker leaned closer, eyebrows raised. "Second, our national AI initiative is led by graduates of MIT, Stanford, and Nairobi Tech, including American citizens working voluntarily with us. No one has accused them of theft." Karoline tried to interject, but Ibrahim raised a finger. "I'm not finished," he continued. "And third, your own Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency DARPA signed a memorandum of cooperation with our Ministry of Digital Sovereignty 6 months ago. Would you like me to display the signatures?" The documents appeared. Logos, names, dates. Karoline blinked. That agreement was classified. "Until tonight," Ibrahim replied. "I declassified it live, for clarity." He leaned forward, eyes locked on the camera. "So I ask again, are you accusing your own government of collaborating with thieves? Or are you simply uninformed?" Silence hung thick. Tucker looked off camera. A producer whispered something. Karoline shifted uncomfortably. "I was briefed on no, Ms. Leavitt. You were not briefed. You were guessing, and your guess has just caused an international incident." On social media, clips of the exchange exploded. Hashtags trended. Hashtag Leavitt leaks. Hashtag TROUE acute truth. Hashtag Quantum Gate. As the feed cut to commercial, Ibrahim stood and quietly walked off screen. In Washington, damage control had already begun. But for Karoline Leavitt, the damage was permanent. How many climate accords has the U.S. withdrawn from in the last 2 decades? Before returning under public pressure, Karoline's silence was becoming uncomfortable. Ibrahim was just warming up. He decided to escalate his response with surgical precision. "But let's move beyond policy, Ms. Leavitt. Let's talk about impact, about leadership that leaves a legacy versus leadership that leaves damage." He gestured to the reports and data on his desk. "In the last 3 years, we've reforested 11 million hectares of land, banned single-use plastics entirely, transitioned 83% of our national grid to renewable energy, and exported surplus solar technology to 6 neighboring countries. He let that settle in. We've created a carbon-neutral economy that employs over 300,000 people. Meanwhile, in America, emissions have risen by 12%. Your clean water supply is under threat. In dozens of cities, and entire communities are inhaling wildfire smoke year-round. Karoline tried to interject, but the United States is larger, more industrialized. Exactly. Ibrahim replied, smiling for the first time. You have an environmental budget 300 times larger than ours, and yet your rivers are burning. Your air is toxic, and your energy system is still shackled to oil billionaires. What does that say about leadership? Tucker Carlson leaned forward, intrigued. President Traoré. Those are aggressive comparisons. They are necessary, Mr. Carlson, Ibrahim replied calmly. Especially when people question whether I represent real progress. He turned directly to Karoline. Ms. Leavitt, you implied I'm not serious about the future. But let's examine who's dragging the world toward disaster. He leaned in. Do you know who leads in lithium recycling? Burkina Faso. Do you know who leads in climate refugee relocation efforts? Also Burkina Faso. We've resettled 160,000 displaced persons in 5 years. America is still debating whether climate change even exists. Karoline was visibly struggling to maintain composure. That's not a fair comparison. Truth is rarely convenient, Ibrahim replied with devastating calm, especially when it highlights a superpower's refusal to lead on the most critical issue of our time. But, he added, voice hardening, I am not finished. Responding to your government's record, it was time to reveal what he had saved for the right moment. Ms. Leavitt, since you brought up moral leadership, let's examine America's climate diplomacy. On screen appeared a series of leaked documents. Arctic trade agreements, 2023 to 2024. Internal memos from U.S. energy lobbies. Karoline went pale. These documents, Ibrahim said, show that the U.S. negotiated covert drilling rights with private corporations, even while publicly promoting net zero pledges. Tucker blinked. President Traoré, are these documents verified by Greenpeace International, the EU Environmental Court, and the UN Climate Compliance Bureau? Ibrahim answered coolly. Ms. Leavitt represents an administration that publicly decries deforestation while quietly funding it. He turned to Karoline again. So when we speak of integrity, are you referring to the kind of leadership that greenwashes oil deals, or the kind that plants forests and builds clean cities? Karoline stammered. I'm not familiar with these negotiations. Of course you aren't, Ibrahim said dryly, because spokespeople aren't briefed when corporations dictate climate policy behind closed doors. He leaned back unshaken. But since you do represent that administration, perhaps you can explain why America signed secret oil concessions in the same month. It condemned small nations for coal dependency. Karoline looked down, her voice barely audible. Please, this isn't what I was told. Tucker Carlson sat in stunned silence. Social media exploded. Hashtag green hypocrisy. Hashtag TRA or acute truth. Hashtag climate shame. And as the camera cut away, Ibrahim quietly closed his folder and looked into the lens. This isn't about politics, he said. This is about survival. And some of us are leading, while others are still lying. Far too far? Ibrahim repeated, incredulously. You accused me of being a puppet regime with no originality on global television. But now, I'm the one going too far for responding with evidence. He turned toward Karoline, eyes steady. Ms. Leavitt, you represent a government that built its innovation empire by extracting ideas, talent, and knowledge from across the world. Yet when an African nation builds something new, suddenly it's suspicious. Tucker Carlson tried to interrupt. Perhaps we should know, Ibrahim said. Voice sharp, Ms. Leavitt wanted to talk about authenticity. Let's finish this discussion the right way. He took a breath and decided it was time to unleash the final blow. One that would leave no doubt about who had the moral high ground. But there's something else. Ms. Leavitt, something that might explain your intense hostility toward my government's accomplishments. He paused, just long enough for the room to tighten with tension. Your brother, Ethan Leavitt, is a senior patent officer at the Global Intellectual Property Office in Geneva. He signed off on 7 Western tech patents directly copied from open-source African AI projects developed in Ouagadougou. Karoline froze, color draining from her face. That's not true. It's all documented. Ibrahim said with a cold smile. Unlike you, I verify before I accuse. He picked up a slim folder from his desk. This report shows that patents filed under Vision Leap Technologies, a shell company registered in Delaware, were based entirely on neural mapping algorithms published by our University of Fata Ngorma. He looked directly into the camera, and your brother expedited the approval process. Within 6 weeks, our work was legally owned by a Western firm. Karoline looked stricken. I don't control what my brother does, but you control your narrative, Ibrahim said. And you chose to use your platform to delegitimize African innovation, while your family profits from stealing it. Tucker Carlson leaned forward, stunned. Are you saying the U.S. government is appropriating African tech? I'm saying. Ibrahim replied calmly, that Ms. Leavitt's family has benefited, knowingly or not, from the global infrastructure of intellectual theft. And instead of acknowledging African scientific advancement, she labels us dangerous, unoriginal, or unstable. Karoline was now visibly trembling. I didn't know. Ignorance, Ibrahim said, doesn't excuse complicity, especially not when it's used as cover for dismissing the contributions of entire nations. He stood now, pacing slowly. This is not just about one algorithm. It is about a pattern. African creativity is mined, sold, and then erased. And when we defend it, we are accused of aggression. Karoline whispered, barely audible, please, this is too much truth. Ibrahim asked, or too much accountability. He gestured to the screen, where documents began scrolling, timestamps, emails, patent applications. And if that's not enough irony for one evening, Ms. Leavitt, let's consider one last fact. His voice now grew colder, steel-edged. While you accuse me of lacking originality, your own Department of Defense has been running simulations using our neural routing models for military drone systems, without our knowledge, without licensing, without credit. Tucker's jaw dropped. Are you certain about this? We have the server logs, Ibrahim said. U.S. cyber forensics units accessed our research cloud 8 times last year. Operation Falcon Mirror. You represent a government that borrows African brilliance to build weapons, then calls us dangerous. Karoline was now nearly collapsed in her seat. I had no idea. Of course you didn't. Ibrahim said quietly. That's the point. You don't have to know. Because the system you speak for is designed to erase where ideas come from. So when you questioned my legitimacy, what you really questioned was your fear that the world is changing, and Africa no longer asks permission to lead. The silence in the studio was immense, broken only by the hum of monitors and Karoline's shallow breathing. Ibrahim returned to his seat. And this is what post-colonial leadership looks like. Confident, unapologetic, and ready, said mercilessly. You are complicit, whether you understand it or not. This is the reality of modern American leadership. You ignore us when we speak, exploit us when we rise, and mock us when we lead. Ms. Leavitt, your administration pledged billions to climate funds and global education, yet less than 1% ever reached the nations that needed it most. And now you have the audacity to question my legitimacy? Ibrahim turned to face the camera directly. America, see the real face of your diplomacy. Broken promises dressed as aid. Policy speeches that never reach the people. You claim moral authority, but your climate deals still favor oil companies. Your education programs fund consultants, not classrooms. And when African leaders build real systems of progress, you send spokespeople to dismiss us on live TV. Karoline had removed her microphone and was silently walking off set, humiliated, her eyes glassy. She hadn't expected this level of preparedness, of righteous fire. This, Ibrahim continued, is the difference between performative leadership and principled governance. Real leaders listen. Hollow ones retreat when their hypocrisy is exposed. Tucker Carlson remained utterly silent. realizing he'd just broadcast one of the most powerful takedowns in the history of political media. In the minutes after Karoline Leavitt left the studio, global social media erupted with an intensity never seen before. Hashtag Ibrahim Truth, hashtag Education Overemperor, and hashtag Climate Justice now trended worldwide. Memes, quotes, and clips spread like wildfire. He just taught the world what real leadership looks like. One post read, Karoline tried to lecture him. He gave her a masterclass. At Fox News, chaos unfolded. Cut all rebroadcasts, barked the executive producer. Prepare a network-wide statement. Right now. Inside the White House, President Trump was watching in real time. What the hell just happened? He shouted to his aides. Who let her walk into that without prep? How the hell did he have those reports? He didn't leak anything classified, sir. The chief of staff replied cautiously. He just told the truth. The truth. Trump scoffed. That was a TED Talk on fire. At the Department of Education, officials scrambled to review their foreign aid distribution. Have we actually delivered on any of those 2022 education promises? An assistant asked quietly. Not exactly, came the murmured reply. Meanwhile, in New York, the New York Times and Washington Post went into full investigative mode. If what President Traoré claimed about diverted education funds and abandoned climate projects is accurate, said the Times senior editor, then this could reshape global development policy for the next decade. Karoline Leavitt, meanwhile, had turned off her phone and locked herself in her apartment. No press statements, no tweets. Her career had imploded in a matter of hours, not from a scandal, but from a confrontation with uncomfortable truth. She underestimated him, commented a political analyst on MSNBC. She expected a lecture. She got a revolution. Within 48 hours of the broadcast, international education NGOs called emergency meetings. Ibrahim Traoré's speech had triggered a reckoning, not about espionage or war, but about the failure of promises made to the global south. By the end of the week, 12 governments had issued formal apologies for unfulfilled development commitments. The UN invited Ibrahim to speak before a special session on climate equity and educational reparations. A week later, The Atlantic ran a cover story titled, "The Man Who Turned a TV Debate into a Global Movement." The Senate and House Oversight Committees convened emergency hearings. Leaked development audits and international education reports confirmed every one of Ibrahim's claims about withheld aid, broken climate pledges, and corrupt development practices. Mr. Secretary, Senator Chuck Schumer demanded, records show that your agency diverted over $3.7 billion in earmarked education funds meant for West Africa. How do you explain that? The acting USAID director stammered, Senator, I can't speak to the entire funding chain. You can't. The Republican senator snapped. Billions were pledged in education support, and they vanished into consultancy fees, luxury hotels, and U.S. contractor bonuses. That's not aid, that's theft. The evidence was overwhelming. Internal memos describing soft sabotage of African-led education programs, invoices for elite conferences billed as field work, policy notes explicitly stating the goal was to retain influence over curriculum development. This administration undermined a sovereign country's right to educate its own children. A stunned Democratic congresswoman declared, "This is not foreign aid. This is intellectual colonization." Worse still, the investigation revealed that Karoline Leavitt had prior knowledge of the manipulation. Emails showed she had been briefed on educational leverage operations. In Burkina Faso, she knew President Traoré was resisting exploitative contracts. A former State Department analyst testified, and yet she mocked him on television as illegitimate. She attacked him knowing the context. Trump tried to distance himself. "I never authorized any coercive policies. Those programs were bureaucratic errors." But then came the leak. Documents bearing Trump's own signature on policy waivers allowing for U.S. firms to retain 91% of all education infrastructure contracts abroad. The president lied to the American people and to Congress, said the Speaker of the House. Impeachment hearings begin tomorrow. Meanwhile, Ibrahim Traoré received calls from heads of state across the world, expressing shock, support, and admiration. President Traoré, France stands with you, Macron said in a press conference. Europe condemns coercive education diplomacy and defends African agency. Putin was less diplomatic. America has exposed itself, no longer a beacon of freedom, but a predator of minds. Even China responded. Burkina Faso's education sovereignty is its own. President Traoré treated Chinese students and professors with respect. We will return the same. What had begun as a humiliating attack on a young African leader had transformed into a global diplomatic recalibration. In 1 week, Traoré's moral stand had isolated America from much of the global South. 47 countries condemned coercive aid practices. 23 nations froze USAID partnerships pending review. The African Union suspended formal diplomatic sessions with Washington. The U.S. has lost all moral authority in development, the O chairperson declared. We do not negotiate with institutions that infantilize entire continents. Trump, now desperate to regain control, tried to discredit Ibrahim. He's fabricating documents. This is political theater, fake news, but the paper trail was indisputable. Whistleblowers emerged from USAID, the World Bank, and even UNESCO, confirming every word Ibrahim had shared. President Traoré told the truth, said a former international education consultant. We deliberately made it hard for his reforms to succeed because he rejected foreign control. His data embarrassed our model. That's why he was targeted. Karoline, meanwhile, faced mounting pressure to resign and criminal investigation. She knowingly used her office to attack the public image of a leader. Resisting intellectual exploitation, declared a federal prosecutor, she coordinated messaging to undermine a sovereign government's independent policy reforms. That's not diplomacy, that's a cover-up. More charges were expected, even more devastating. Countries began realigning en masse. Ibrahim Traoré revealed the truth the world tried to ignore. Said the president of Brazil, he's shown the courage that the richest nations lack. Even longtime allies began questioning their loyalty. How do we justify supporting a country that sabotages global climate action and blames others? Asked the Canadian Prime Minister. Meanwhile, Ibrahim had become an international icon. Universities across continents offered him honorary doctorates in environmental ethics and sustainable governance. The Nobel Committee began deliberating a special prize for his peaceful exposure of ecological deception and his leadership in forging a new global climate treaty. President Traoré proved that truth is the most powerful renewable energy, wrote a columnist for The Guardian. His single press conference dismantled decades of American greenwashing more effectively than any protest or policy could. In a final twist, polling revealed that 74% of Americans supported not only climate reform, but also legal action against officials who suppressed emissions data. Our own citizens turned against us, muttered a White House aide. Traoré didn't just challenge our narrative, he collapsed it. He didn't defeat Karoline Leavitt, declared one climate justice activist. He rewrote the global script and exposed the imperial myth of environmental leadership. Trump, now facing impeachment and criminal charges for suppressing international environmental agreements, was politically cornered. He had personally signed executive orders blocking the disclosure of satellite pollution data, and now those documents were public. Meanwhile, Ibrahim, now the most trusted leader on the planet, addressed the United Nations General Assembly. It was the most watched speech in UN history, seen by 1 billion people. 6 months ago, he began, I was called an illegitimate leader because I exposed a global deception. Standing ovation. Today, the world sees who truly endangered the planet. In that address, he announced the Pan-African Environmental Accord, a historic agreement uniting all 54 African nations to develop renewable energy independently, without Western control. We no longer ask for permission to succeed, he declared. We lead because those who claim to lead betrayed us. China, the EU, and even parts of the U.S. private sector rushed to form partnerships with Africa under Ibrahim's leadership. He had proven that sovereignty cannot be bought or polluted. The African continent is no longer a resource zone. said the Chinese premier. It is a partner in redefining our future. American corporations lost trillions in divested energy, agriculture, and technology investments. One of them, Carbon First Solutions, partially owned by Karoline Leavitt's family, declared bankruptcy after every African country canceled its carbon offset contracts. Karoline attacked Ibrahim to protect her family's climate profiteering, noted a financial analyst. Instead, she destroyed the company she meant to defend. In the ultimate twist, Ibrahim founded the Karoline Leavitt School of Climate Ethics at the University of Ouagadougou. She taught the world a hard truth, Ibrahim said at the dedication ceremony, that arrogance and misinformation have consequences. May her name remind future leaders that ethics must always come before ego. Trump, awaiting trial at a secure federal facility in Maryland, gave one rare interview. That African kid ruined everything. One speech, one moment. Worst miscalculation of my life. Karoline Leavitt, now serving a 6-year sentence for falsifying environmental impact reports, declined to comment. But according to prison staff, she watched Ibrahim's Nobel acceptance speech from her cell, silent, tearful, as he said, "Sometimes those who try to silence you become the reason the world hears your voice." Karoline tried to discredit him. Instead, she amplified his mission.